All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third episode of Imagine a World Without Police. And this is a series of community conversations that the Austin Justice Coalition is hosting every Wednesday. We'll give people a few more minutes to pour into the chat, to pour into the webinar before we get started. This is exciting. Can everyone hear my audio now? I think there was a problem with the audio from the video in the introduction, but I think that we're good now. All right, cool. All right, so today's episode, we're going to talk about the intersections between housing segregation, homelessness, and policing. But since the name of this webinar is called Imagine a World Without Police, I wanted us to start today. But I wanted to ask all the panelists to do a little exercise with me. If you could close your eyes for 1 minute, just close your eyes, take a deep breath, everyone who's on the panel, and just think for a moment, try to picture what a world without police looks like for you. And then we'll go around and just hear just a short answer from everyone, just a few things about what that world looks like, what that world tastes like, what that world feels like to you. All right. I think that was about a minute. Who wants to start? Any volunteers to go first?
I can start. And a minute in live stream time is probably much longer than real time. So I'm Shoshana Krieger, I'm with BASTA. So when I'm thinking about a world without police, I've been really steeped, and BASTA has been really steeped in a fight to get eviction moratoriums extended and to ensure that we don't create a second man-made public health crisis in this moment. So the police I'm thinking of are the constables, who are the folks who execute writs of possession, which is the final stage of an eviction when law enforcement is forcibly removing a person and their belongings from their home. And the violence of that act. And I know from having conversations with constables, it's also traumatic for the constables themselves, and obviously incredibly traumatic for every person who has experienced an eviction themselves. So the world I'm thinking of is a world in which housing is a human right, in which we have roofs over our heads and we don't need law enforcement to be able to impose the landlord's way, and where you just kind of are constantly at fear of losing kind of your haven.
That's great, thank you. Who's going next?
I'll go next. I'm Maggie with Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. And, you know, when you say close your eyes and imagine a world without police, my immediate feeling was safety. And I say that as a formerly incarcerated person. To me, police cause panic attacks. I know that if I get pulled over, I am 100 times more likely to go to jail than my white counterpart. So I am terrified of police, even if I'm not doing anything wrong, you know, but I've been sentenced to harsh sentences for, you know, misdemeanor crimes. But so without police, I feel like it would be safe and I could have justice, you know, like community policing or just being able to work things out together. I mean, it feels safety to me.
Thank you for that.
I think about a lot of things, but I'll I'll start using kind of the example of my colleagues here, which, working to decriminalize homelessness, and now seeing today the contract with Relief Enterprises, who handles the sweeps of people experiencing homelessness who live outside in certain locations, being renewed. I think about it in terms of people not being forced to live in underpasses and then be told what possessions they can and cannot keep, and be told that if they don't give up their possessions, that they're going to potentially be arrested, be ticketed, be arrested, be taken to jail, by virtue of the fact that they don't have somewhere else to go, they don't have somewhere else to keep the things that they own. And so yeah, I similarly see a world where everyone has a place to be and a place where they can keep their belongings and can't be told and forced to give up their possessions.
Thank you. Matt?
No, I think for me, it's a world where public safety works for everyone, and those who need support and need to access that sort of support in the community have access to non-punitive forms of support to help them achieve the safety that they desire and that they need in their community. And I think about it from a public safety perspective, because for my friends and family, for myself who don't feel comfortable and safe around the police as I do, and I think that's that's one thing when I close my eyes, I thought of how a world where public safety is prioritized in non-punitive ways. And I also thought a lot about how we invest in punitive forms of sort of managing people, or for lack of a better word, or managing communities, and what an investment would look like that was non-punitive and supportive and worked for everyone, not just work for a few. And so I think the world that's constructed now is one that works for a few and not for all, or not for many. And I think imagine a world where people feel safety in their space wherever they are.
So I'm not gonna lie, the first thing I thought about was Nikia's block party with samosas. And then I was like, stop thinking about that. But that sounds like a really good life without a world without police. But my vision is where there's no surveillance, right? When you see a cop sitting like in a parking lot across the street, just kind of doing their thing, you don't really think in your mind, but once they're on the road, they're doing sweeps, they're, surveilling, making sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that feels too under surveillance. And that do we need that to have public safety and have a community that supports each other. So everybody has housing of their choice. They can live where they want to live. And in those spaces, you have block parties, you have communal giving of needs, you have real conversations that allow for people to come to meaningful resolution that works best for both of them. And so that in that way, you community is incredibly stressed, and public safety rides along with that wave, right? Opposed to having this need for these militarized surveillance that's monitoring life as we know it, and that we can really live free in what liberation really looks like for people, not just Black people, but for everybody too, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's funny for me when I think about, a world without police, I really think about just being able to be in public spaces, like you said, Kendra, and not need to have money in the bank or present myself in a certain way or speak in a certain way or to be respected as an individual, as a person, really. and just a world where, if one day I raise children, I can, my children can go out down the street, ride their bikes, and I won't be afraid of, having someone call the cops on them. So I think about a world where there is just permission to be in public, in public spaces, regardless of how much money you have in the bank. And I also think of a world where people know each other in communities. So if someone is in crisis, if someone needs help, if someone isn't going to be able to, make ends meet, and then there's people they can reach out to on their street, in their neighborhood, in their block. There's places they can go. There's a support network there, so people don't feel isolated when they're going through a crisis or facing challenges or difficulties of some sort. And that leads to the first question that I wanted to throw out to all the panelists, which is, what do you think, what does the alternative to policing look like in the work that you do right now? Or what would steps be that would move us towards that alternative, if that makes sense? Matt, would you be interested in going first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think, in the work as it relates to, responding to people experiencing homelessness, it looks like a renewed and reinvigorated partnership with folks that are helping us with public safety in this community, and a reimagining of what that engagement looks like for people who are living on the streets, unsheltered or without homes. And I think that what that looks like is a non-punitive partnership with the goal of getting people connected to the resources they need, not the goal of trying to move somebody away from a business that's complaining about someone camping or someone's possessions. And it looks like working towards not trying to get people's basic needs met on the street or in an unsheltered situation. It's address and understanding that we need to change that person's environment for the better, and impact them and that person in a way that's engaging, friendly, and non-punitive. And I think that those partnerships are critical and crucial. And it looks like, expanded behavioral health services on our in our outreach and engagement teams across the city. It looks like access to street medicine in our community, where we're bringing healthcare into the community right now, and we're investing in that. If we invested in street medicine programs and more outreach and engagement for folks into the community, and created pipelines into housing opportunities, and shutting off the pipelines of folks falling into homelessness through other systems that we'll talk about later. And I think the real focus has to be, using harm reduction practices and trauma-informed lens, and approaching everyone's situation differently. And what I've noticed through my years in interactions with police officers when they've engaged people experiencing homelessness is that it's very easy for them to say, this is just another person experiencing homelessness in this spot, and not to be to take an individual approach to each person's care that they come across. And when that happens, you end up really just lazy policing and pushing the problem down the road. And so I think really it's engaged and active outreach and partnerships with the service provider community, and getting people the services they need in the places that they are in non-punitive ways.
Conversation. Jump in, add something if you want to say something.
Well, I'll just go next if that's all right. I couldn't agree more with what Matt said, and I think ultimately it looks like housing, right? It looks like people not actually having to live outside. They don't want to, and having a place where everyone can go and be safe and have access to healthcare, for sure. I think, obviously there's a lot of other components to it, and it really strikes at the central core, of society and civilization, and how do we adjudicate conflicts, and how do we get along with each other, right? And how do we settle differences? I think one big piece that people often don't think about or talk about as much is the role of sex education. Education about bodily autonomy, education about consent, all throughout our primary school days. One of the biggest issues in our city and in most cities, when we talk about harm, when we talk about real harm and violence, is domestic violence, is family violence, what often called gender-based violence, but what I think more and more has been called patriarchal violence, right? It's and until we are really educating everyone from the earliest age as possible about the harm of that, and obviously the tendency that our society builds towards these sorts of relationships and the harm that they cause, it's difficult to see a path beyond just simple response to it, which is all that we do today, and we don't do very well. So I think that's a big part of a future without police in my world.
I want to go next. In the criminal legal world, the way I think alternative to policing, looking at it through a lens of ending mass incarceration, I believe investing in communities, focusing our money on keeping families together. There's a huge pipeline, mental health to prison, to homelessness, substance use to homelessness to prison. Poverty is criminalized. Children grow up to become, people who do harm, not because they want to, but because of their circumstances in the beginning. So why don't we start at the beginning? Invest in those communities, invest in those families that are struggling, instead of investing millions of dollars on riot gear and pepper spray. We could be creating a better world if we focus on public health and public safety, help people through substance use disorder, and attack the mental health issues. So that's my alternative thinking.
I'm gonna also hop in, although I'm gonna try to combine a couple of thoughts I have together. But I want to echo everything that's already been said, particularly around resources, both for people and for knowledge of people, right? I spoke to a neighborhood association a couple of weeks ago, and they're asking similar questions. Who do you call instead of 911? And we had a dormant public safety committee in our neighborhood. Should we reactivate that, and what does that look like for us, right? And those are all like community-based things, and also figuring out how to inform communities about different resources. I was in Portland one time, and they had this like little book called The Roots or something like that. And it's simple, like blue guide, but it's a way for people to figure out what other organizations and are being able to provide resources, so that it's, you're not calling. You can call 311 or even 211 for certain things. This is also kind of a handy guide, right? And so providing those resources to the community members for folks that are experiencing homeless, and also for community members to help folks that are experiencing homelessness, or just general situations that occur in your neighborhood, right? And I just think really having a robust system or community-based way of allowing folks to know what's already available, so that you can tap into other sources, right? I was listening to so it's a lot of ideas, sorry. I was listening to a podcast on restorative justice, and the woman was similar to Chris's. She experienced sexual assault growing up from her dad until he died when she was 16. And so then her pathway is kind of being, how do you deal with that anger? How do you feel with that trauma? And so they got her into restorative justice practices. And so she's like having the, like really thinking about like a quote that she said, I really like, was like, the work of love isn't gentle or tepid all the time, but it's always worth it, right? So having these conversations through love and through compassion and through care, and really generating a community of care so that you can dispel these, you know, crisis situations, and also being able to have real in-depth conversations about trauma, about harm, and being able to resolve those over time. And it doesn't look pretty all the time, but it's a better way, and it gets us stronger as a community. And that's kind of the world I'd want to live in.
That's awesome. Shoshana?
So, I mean, what everyone just said resonated a little bit or a lot from every person. I think that for our work at BASTA, working with folks who are generally housed and on the brink of possibly being unhoused, the alternative looks like, the word which Matt used of punitive really resonated with me, that the kind of culture of policing and law enforcement in a punitive manner permeates the experience of tenants, and especially low-income tenants and tenants of color in Austin, of that you live in an environment which is policed by your landlord, by your manager, by the security guards who patrol. We have tenants at tenants associations who have been tased at their properties by security guards. One of the biggest things we hear is about management bullying, about getting lease violations for a crying baby, for a too loud TV, of this like knee-jerk reaction of the way in which we are going to solve problems is through exercising power over, as opposed to what all of the folks have been talking about, which is alternative forms of how are we solving a problem. Like if the TV is too loud, our neighbor's complaining, is there a conversation to be had? How are we addressing it, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm threatening housing and I have power over you? And I think it's the punitive power of policing and of the way in which we conceive of policing right now, and policing is done right now in this country, which permeates so many different relationships and the power imbalances, and that manifests itself, I know every day, in the lives of the folks who we work with. So one kind of, when thinking of alternatives, one of the properties we work with, North Lamar Mobile Home Park, just purchased their community as a cooperative. And so one of the things the association is now dealing with is, okay, how are we resolving these issues? And a kind of knee-jerk reaction of a lot of folks is, okay, we issue lease violations. We kind of do what we've always done and what's been modeled for us. And there's a lot of work to be done and being like, okay, let's take a step back. How can we have, you know, this person's having parties like very late into the night. How do we resolve this in a different manner? And I think that's where, and so we're talking about like mediation, we're talking about all sorts of things, but that's where like the real work of what the alternative looks like, because it's not so easy to just say like, okay, like we got resources, we talk about it, everything's dandy. It's gonna be difficult and it's gonna be messy, but if we don't try and we don't struggle through it, then we're never gonna have an alternative world.
Sorry, Shoshana, I want to actually ask you to go a little bit deeper there. When you talk about some of these crisis situations that require sort of mediation, right? The neighbor is making noise, and kind of my default, if I have this problematic neighbor, might be to try to pick up the phone and just call the police if I don't know of any other way of handling that. Experience like solutions there in mediating those conflicts?
So my internet cut out for a bit, so I don't know if I fully got your question. Actually,
it might have been my internet.
Either or. Can you quickly recap?
Yeah, no, so I'll just repeat the question. So the question is basically if you could speak a little bit to the conflict. You mentioned the need to sort of solve conflicts in these apartment complexes. I'll never forget, this really stuck to me. Actually, I have a little piece afterwards from this book, but from Matthew Desmond's Evicted. And he describes these mobile home complexes and kind of low income tenant properties that have these high volumes of police calls. And further down the road, in many ways, there's this like direct overlap where the high volumes of police calls coming from a lot of these low income rental properties are then used to frame these properties as sort of blights on the community. And then that feeds into a series of planning policies that try to then close those properties down completely, just sort of redevelop them into something new. It's as if the city first, segregates all these poor people into this property, kind of abandons them, removes all social resources or support except for the police. And then you get police, and then the city goes, oh, you know what? This is a sort of a moral blight. We got to shut it down, and redevelop it, and then it leads to a process of displacement. So I was thinking, going back into that moment of calling on the police, if there's some work that you've been doing around this crisis resolution, or even, this idea of the neighbor is making a lot of noise, so I might pick up the phone and just call the cops. If you've found other ways, or have started at least looking at ways of intervening in that kind of situation.
So I wouldn't say we've found ways. I would say we've thought about ways. We've been starting to explore ways. One of the tenants associations we work with, we started talking with some restorative justice orgs to see if they could come in and we could get them funded. It's a subsidized property. So there's support services dollars, which have to be allocated, and the contract they had with their support services provider was up. And so we reached out to some restorative justice folks and we're like, okay, is this an opportunity? Because a lot of the concerns among the tenants were that youth and youth crime rates and youth being up to no good and all sorts of things. And so we're like, okay, is there a way we can like reframe this and be having kind of larger conversations about it? And that we dabbled with it. It didn't pan out, but that's, I think, a tool of being like, okay, what are these alternative mechanisms? And I think a lot of what's crucial to that is the collective, that it's not just the property owner or one tenant or a couple of tenants being like, yes, we want to do this, but it's that as a community, folks have enough buy-in to say, no, we want ourselves and our neighbors to be able to stay here and work together and be a community. And I think there's a real struggle with that in Austin because we don't have rent control. So we have a lot of housing impermanency, which means that we have folks who move from place to place, year to year to year. So you don't have those really deep roots in a lot of larger complexes. So I think that permanency is a really important piece of being able to problem solve collectively as a community. I'm not sure if that really answered your question.
No, that's great. That's great. Does anyone else want to add anything?
I want to say that I really appreciate what Shoshana said about how calling the cops is easy. I can pick up the phone all day long and call the cops. But going over there and actually talking to that person, making a connection with that person, finding out what's going on, see how we can help. That's too much work for some people. But I mean, it's amazing how much a little compassion can change the course of an entire life.
And I think a little bit about how it's a request for folks who many times in those situations have been abandoned by a lot of their community, right? Maybe they're native Austinites and they grew up, but now their housing options are shrinking and there's scarcity happening. And it's a request on our behalf, I suppose, or on others' behalf to make that investment in their community when their community hasn't invested in them. And I think that piece where we find we're moving folks from out of experiencing homelessness and into housing, and we're like, okay, here are the keys, and just assume that you're ready to play by these set of rules. Like, this is how this goes now. For the last 10 years, you've been sleeping unsheltered on the street, and nobody has come by and tried to offer support to you. But now we're going to move you in, and we're going to expect you to live by this set of norms that is constructed by folks who have been housed their whole lives. And that sort of request and requirement for housing is really problematic, I think, and sort of like to me lends itself to people feeling like a sense of F you, like this is not, y'all have let me down for so long, and you expect me just to come in and say, okay, quiet hours are between 10 at night and 8 o'clock in the morning, because most folks have jobs from 9 to 5, and I have to respect the fact that they have to sleep. But I think those sorts of things just don't line up very well, and are part of a system of policies around housing and access to housing that I think were created without input from all, and just sort of canned, and now are just accepted by the run of the mill property owner or property manager. And those are tough things to ask folks to just smoothly glide right into, and to feel a connection to, when it's not part of what their day-to-day has been, and quite frankly not feeling investment in the community that has abandoned them a lot of times.
I want to ask a question off of what you said, Matt, and about how do you acclimate instead of assimilate, right, to your community, right? If you think about housing segregation, right, we're trying to, in some respects, people call it move to opportunity, right? But essentially, at least my goal and my vision is that people can live wherever they want to. But when you have segregated communities and you try to find housing in communities that don't look like me, right? And so you end up being those few people in this community that's really touchy, and having to acclimate to your community and hoping that they support you. What are some strategies to kind of be able to make that move better, or like helping folks and community folks kind of best ways to kind of support each other and open up those doors of communication, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'll just give a quick, because I think others probably have good answers to this too. From my perspective, putting the onus on the person moving into a community, if you're a Black household moving into a mostly white community, putting the onus on the Black household to figure out how to communicate and integrate into that system is exactly why we have these terribly segregated communities. And the onus and the welcoming and I'll give a quick story. My parents were hippies, they were really like, they'll talk to you about anything, and all they believed in, they talked about believing in social justice and civil rights. But my parents didn't have any Black friends when I was growing up. I mean, I didn't, how welcoming could that environment have been for folks, and that the environment that they thought where they were creating for people? And I think if it's going to actually, if as a community we're going to prioritize like making safe spaces for people in any community, then I think, those conversations need to be had by the communities that are difficult to penetrate for some folks, and people need to really step up and create space in very meaningful, intentional ways, because there's been so much happening in the other direction that it shouldn't be on that the Black household to come into the white community and say, well, now how do I figure this out? Like, it shouldn't be how it is. I'm not suggesting that that's not the case now. So I would see that what some strategies might be to others who might have some insight in that area. I would just say that in my view, it's a role put squarely in a task and a call to action put squarely on those communities that are really white and segregated.
Matt, in a couple of comments that you've made so far, I noticed a recurring theme is you talk about environment, both the environment that people have to live in when they're homeless. You talked about the idea of a welcoming environment in terms of desegregating spaces. And I was wondering if in some of the work in advocacy and some of the experience that you guys have gathered, if you guys have seen experiences where experiences of changing environments, and what that has looked like, or if you've if there's any sort of information you might have on that, or thoughts, even if not experience, on what that process of transforming an environment looks like.
That's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, yeah, that's a good question. Let me think on that. And I don't know if anyone else has to answer that, but honestly, I think, sadly, nothing comes and jumps to mind around how that, the work specifically in homeless services or in homelessness has, that environments have changed for the better in the work that we've done. So give me a minute to think about that. It's a great question, and one that I think I would have to marinate on for a minute.
I think that's what this space is all about, is allowing some things to marinate.
Yeah, that was good.
So we can grow some ideas. But Maggie, I saw you nodding your head. Do you want to add something?
Yes. When you were speaking, I was thinking about the feeling of being homeless. That environment is dehumanizing in itself. So reaching out for help and trying to get on your feet. I mean, it's just a different, and I can say this from experience, it's a different type of experience. You come out feeling, and even from prison, when you come out from prison, you feel like a feral animal. So I think that what's helped me this time is there's a new conversation being had. People are starting to open up and actually listen, that I'm not just some number, I'm actually a person. And so that's kind of opened the environment for there to be a fluid conversation about these pipelines. And so I think that's been very important, in helping others.
Yeah. Chris, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
Well, I feel like I'm learning a lot and just appreciating the conversation. I guess one thing that has come to mind is just the extent to which the idea of and the power of policing embeds in all of us in different contexts, and it's something that I think is important for us to acknowledge and to be working on in this time when we are working to pull back and rein in and reduce and dream of a day when we don't have this monopoly of state violence. How we all seek to, in different contexts, really try to force conformity and control over our situation, and through the threat of various forms of punishment, right? And a neighborhood association is a perfect example of that, where while they may not, many have the force of contract, which ultimately can lead to actual state involvement. Others are simply trying to impose this conformity upon their neighbors through their own internal motivation, separate from any state goal, and how harmful that is, not just for the people that they impose that on, but for themselves and for their community. And how, it's something that we all have to look out for. We heard the 911 call from Mike Ramos during the released, police footage on Monday. And, it's clear that whatever this person was saying was not the case on the ground. What motivated them, I can't know. But it's clear that they wanted police involvement into the situation, in a situation that ultimately did not require it. And the question is why? What brings a person to want to impose violence, whether from the state or others, onto people? And what's to be gained out of that situation? I think we all have to be questioning, not just when we call 911 or what motivates us to think about involving the state or any actor who might use violence, but when are we trying to enforce conformity upon a situation, and what lengths are we willing to go to do it, and try to check that and question that.
Oh, that's awesome. And I just wanted to say to the participants who are posting questions, we're going to get around to answering. We're going to start answering some of your questions in just a little bit. So stick with us. And we're going to invite some of you on. If you're willing to join us, we're going to actually invite you to turn your camera on in a little bit, a few of you, and come in and join us and ask your questions to all the panelists. But before we go there, I wanted to go back again to this. I think this is, we're kind of dancing around several subjects that are all connected and related. And I think that something that we mentioned was this idea of the pipeline, right? There's a pipeline, school to prison pipeline, all these different sort of pipelines that produce these violent and inequitable outcomes. And not only inequitable, just downright dehumanizing, and ultimately, I think these pipelines are, they're meant to just eliminate people who society deems are not useful and productive. But Maggie, you had mentioned this idea of kind of going back and starting at the beginning, which I think is so beautiful and powerful. What if we went all the way back to the beginning, right, to schooling, to the way we raise children, and reimagine that? And yet, at the same time, we live in a world that is full of people who have been through these various brutal pipelines, and who, for various reasons, we can't go back to the beginning. We kind of have to pick up where we're at. And even like thinking about Mike Ramos, right? In many ways, he was someone, a beautiful soul who'd been through this kind of brutal, what the system does to so many of us. So I was thinking about that this idea of the pipeline and the beginning of the pipeline, and but also interrupting the pipeline in the middle, right? How can we think about that? How can we think about what it means to bring people back into community and friendships and relationships who have been already through that pipeline, right? And who, as Matt mentioned, we have this very punitive logic, and we tend to view those people, society tends to view those people through a very punitive lens. So what does it mean? Yeah, I just wanted to like kind of interrupt that pipeline in mid-process, so to speak. Yeah.
When you're talking, I was imagining like myself when I was coming back into society, and before I got caught up in the criminal justice system, I was a honor student going to, playing in the band, and I just totally got sucked into the system. So reintegrating back into society, for me, it didn't work in 2011, the first time I went to prison. Because when I came out, I didn't feel like I was a part of this world. It's a different world whenever you have to beg for money, not shower for days, have filthy socks. You just don't feel the same. Even if you go take a shower and look better, it's a different feeling. So I think it's so important that these people who have already been through this pipeline to show some make them feel human again. There's some PTSD and trauma that comes with that. So, I mean, it's so hard to just say, okay, I'm out of prison. I got the keys to this house. I'm going to go live in this neighborhood and everything's going to be happy. Some people can't even come out of their house for the first week. So I think it's very important that we understand that the system is traumatizing. And so we have to focus on these. And I don't know what the answer would be because everybody's different. But I know for me, I had to learn to trust people, even in public. Sometimes I couldn't go somewhere because I didn't trust anybody. So it's very important that we realize what the system is doing to people and creating these people who are going to come home. Not everybody is locked up forever. Not everybody's going to be homeless forever. So we're continuing to perpetuate this terrible cycle. We're just creating more and more trauma on trauma.
And I wanted to kind of touch on something that we talked about right before we got on, right? Still along the lines of the pipeline, right? Matt was talking about like homelessness is the most expensive fix for the problems, right? Really where money should be invested is upstream, at education, at social services, at more housing, all these things. And so whenever we're in this, defund the police, and siphoning money away and figuring out better ways to utilize this. I disagree with that. And then kind of touching on what Maggie said about, or in kind of the general question about we're thinking about where money should go, that homelessness is the most expensive. I think there's a question on there, like, what does it take to get to zero homelessness? And it'd be a lot cheaper if we spend all that money upstream in creating and investing in education and conflict resolution and restorative justice practices and housing and food security, then kind of how we kind of wait until we get to the purpose and creating systems that work for people, by people, versus the ones that we have, in order to create the vision I think we're all trying to live in.
Yeah, and I think, Kendra, to blend your point, really well said with Maggie's too. I mean, and you also get to you get to defer or not have to be exposed to all the trauma associated with every step of that system along the way. And the household doesn't have to be, dominoed around through the various systems to only come out on the other end in an experience of, now I'm experiencing homelessness, which is, in my opinion, the last stop for folks that have been through and exposed to multiple different types and let down by multiple different types of system, whether it's the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, the foster care system, the juvenile justice system, any other system that's been created to manage and sort of promote the inequities in our society. I think that the end result of that is you end up experiencing homelessness when you've been let down and crashed through all those systems. And on the way, you pick up multiple hundreds of various traumatic events that make as Maggie so well put, like the reintegration back into sort of the mainstream society, for lack of a better word, that much more difficult to manage on your own and without the support that's needed. In a state like Texas, where access to quality, affordable healthcare, behavioral healthcare, mental health care is just about non-existent for anyone who doesn't have private employer-paid insurance. Given that we're not an expansion state, makes it really difficult to find the support needed in order to not find yourself just in despair and interacting with the only well-funded support that we have in this community is support in quotes, for lack of a better word, is the police and accessing back through that pipeline of the criminal justice system. And I'll say that right now, in this moment, as we sit here, the we're on the precipice of making a decision around how we're going to invest in, as Shoshana will talk about, I'm certain, in a pending eviction crisis here in this community and in all communities across the country. And in this moment, there's an opportunity for investment from the federal government, from the state government, we don't see this massive, this massive evictions play out. And, it's an interesting time to sort of think about what we could do with that, with a budget that prioritizes people over punitive means of enforcement.
And to your point, Matt, when we put out the We Fund tool, which was a community budget tool, I think a lot of participants are familiar with it. You guys have probably taken the tool. When we looked at the stats of all the city departments, the department that was most defunded was the police. People reduced police funding more than any other department, but the department that was most funded was neighborhood housing and community development, which shows that I think the community in Austin really feels what you're saying. People feel that housing is a priority, it's a top need. So I appreciate you saying that, and I think we need to keep that in mind as we're moving right now into this council vote, that the community wants to see a greater investment in housing and takes that very seriously. But
I do think though that we need to be thinking about what is that housing? That housing alone, just having a roof over your head is not enough. That, like, Matt, you were just talking about of the just multiple experiences of trauma, which so many folks have. They're so vulnerable. They finally get a roof over their head, and that means they put up with so much. And they put up with so many injustices, and we knock on their doors and you can smell the mold and you can see the roaches, and they are pissed. And we're like, hey, want to do something about it? Want to organize? And they're like, yo, no, like, I don't want to be back institutionalized. I don't want to be back on the street. Like, and they're totally like 100%, like, makes total sense why they don't want to engage. But I think all too often we talk about, okay, if we have no one on the street, then somehow we've solved it. If we have all of those people in housing where we have fat cats with their pockets getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and profiting off of the system which we have set up, which is our housing market, and NHCD is funding all of these guys through, because we fund a whole bunch of private developers. Like, that's not a solution either. So I think we just need to be really careful about not saying housing alone. Okay, that's the answer. What kind of housing? And that we need to be asking that question. Otherwise, all we're doing is replicating the systems in a different form.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. That's awesome. And can I even push you to go further? What kind of housing then? When we think about this kind of decommodified housing, this housing that's housing solution that really puts people at the center, and people's needs and dignity, what does that look like? I mean, I don't expect you to paint the whole picture, but give us some hints of what you think.
Yes, so my answer was going to be decommodified housing, but then you
I stole it.
Question, so you stole it from me, so now I can't use that as my easy answer.
I'm literally just
but I think decommodified housing is the answer. But what's decommodified housing, right? Like, it's a term which is thrown around, and I don't think there is like one answer to it, but it's basically taking the speculative value out of land. So you can think of co-ops. I think co-ops have a lot of problems and a lot of challenges, and I personally don't know if that's the best solution. I think it is a solution, and let's play around. Community land trusts and community land trusts, the traditional community land trust has 3 parts of their board. It's a third of like local, like neighborhood community members, a third residents of the property, and a third who are more like expert types. And you can make those boards different ways, but a community land trust is going to have long-term affordability restrictions in place, and the trust itself, the purpose is for housing. There are some interested limited equity models out of Germany, and like syndicates and things like that. So I think there's a lot to play around with, but the key is to take profit off of the land. So it means that you're taking the land off the market, which means a 20-year Section 8 contract or a 30-year tax credits with 15 years as being the real, like, I guess where it's the hardest to get out of, like, that's not enough, right? Like, that's not decommodifying land. And so who are the folks who we are lending to and we are supporting, and what is their actual commitment to housing, and how are residents having a seat at the table and a say as to what is going on in their properties? Because I think that is really key, which is resident autonomy and being able to have some form of control over their environment, over their housing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. And Kendra, do you have any thoughts? You want to jump in here? I feel like you might have something to add.
I do, but I need to get my thoughts together because I was super stoked about this conversation about decommodified housing. And then it gets to a number of potential things that are kind of outside of the realm of this, I think, of this webinar. And when you talk about, like, how do we promote that in the community, I definitely would like that. But when you think about the racial wealth gap and you not transforming what our tax system looks like, and you wanted to provide this option for folks, but like, who is it for? And if you were trying to promote this to folks who, so I have a lot of questions more than actually answers, who have a lot of barriers to capital and credit and haven't owned a home and are part of the vast wealth gap that you have between different races. How do you promote this sort of like collective housing kind of decommodified scenario where really communal living looks different, and has its its benefits, that kind of detach itself from the monetary value of housing? And so I don't know the answer to that. It's like, I have more questions than answers, because it's something that I definitely would like to continually talk about with folks. But like, when you have for generations not been able to own a home and been able to enter the kind of a housing market, and then you are, your white counterparts make X amount of much money and the wealth is not established generationally, how do you change that in the system? But that's where my thoughts were going, which is not kind of outside of the scope.
Yes, and so I want to like totally have a much longer conversation about this, both online and offline. And we're thinking about actually doing some form of panel on decommodified housing. And this was like exactly the issue, like as we were brainstorming it. I was like playing around with it. So like, I guess I would just like quickly like spitballing is like, okay, so how do we figure out how to capture how much generational wealth that is? How do we make sure that like we don't take that out of the equation and make sure that folks are still getting wealth? And as we're pushing towards a system in which we don't think of housing as wealth creation, and like, I feel like there has to be a way to address that issue because it is such an important issue. I don't know what it is, but I think like smarter minds do know, or maybe all of our minds together like can make that work. But like, that's like a really, really like fundamental and important issue to be thinking about and cracking that nut.
And I think, oh, sorry, no, I was going to say, I think that question itself is very much it's very much like the question of imagining a world without police. It requires us to think outside of the limits of what we already have and what we've been told to accept as sort of the model for life. Because, it's a real challenge for people of color, as Kendra mentioned, thinking of decommodified housing as a solution in a world in which home ownership has been presented as the primary model for wealth building for middle-class Americans. So, we have to think beyond that. But I personally don't think it's possible to imagine a world without police unless we can imagine a world in which human life and human value is worth more than property or bottom lines and profit. So I think that a world without police has to be a world so to speak, which isn't to say we give, we tell people of color, working class people, Black people to give up on the hope of home ownership or building equity, but reimagining what that looks like is a real challenge. And I agree, we're not going to solve this one right now, but I think it's a really interesting question to flag. But Kendra, yeah.
No, it gets me thinking about Christelle's question about what does it take to get to zero homelessness, and I think a world without police needs to be also a world where how do you get to 0% poverty? I think not necessarily tied, they are tied, but I think that's the sort of questions is what does zero poverty look like?
I want to punt this one to both Matt and Chris. This question from Christelle, which we are going to answer live. So how much would it cost to have zero homelessness using a homes first approach? I mean, is a homes first approach the best approach? And if so, what does that look like, and how much would it cost to reach zero homelessness? Anyone want to go first?
Oh, well, Matt would definitely be the right person, but it looks like he's frozen right now. I mean, I guess I will. I will say that this challenge is solvable, and resources play maybe the biggest role in it, in my view, in my perspective. That said, kind of to the previous points, in a world with the level of inequality that we have, in a world with the level of injustice that we have, we are literally 2 weeks away from 20 million evictions. There's no annual budget plan that's gonna overcome that, especially at a local level. And so I know that the numbers have been crunched, and there is a path locally based on what we've seen and what we generally can expect. But I do think that that question also and that desire begs us to go deeper into a larger problem, which is the ability for people to fall into homelessness to begin with, and the underlying poverty at the root of that.
Matt, I'm not sure if you caught the question. You froze there for a minute.
I think my internet was in and out, but if you think repeating it's worth it, I'd love to provide comment, but if you want to move on, I'm fine too.
It was a question from Christelle about how much would it cost to get to zero homelessness using a homes first approach? Yeah. So we have done some modeling in the community that at what that looks like, but I think that the issue of homelessness is a downstream investment. Now again, I'm not suggesting we don't invest in homelessness, but the second we resolve homelessness for everybody that's experiencing homelessness, tomorrow there'll be more unless we make that upstream investment and unless we're doing something to impact the systems that are perpetuating this inequity. And so, I think we've all sort of touched on it a little bit in our conversations, but really I think that the racism and racist policies that have existed and the structural racism in our country is the thing that we have to address. And homelessness is a symptom of that. It's a symptom of racism. That's how homelessness manifests itself. And so unless we're ensuring and in some fashion making investments along that string of other structural inequities in our communities, we're not going to end homelessness in our communities. And I think, I could tell you, so we modeled what would it look like with a 6% increase in poverty and in people needing rental assistance based on the pandemic. And that was about 53,000 households.
we estimated that 53,000 households would need about $425 million in rental assistance to in order to remain housed, and that in order to house the people we believe are experiencing homelessness in our community, that was another $230 million for a whopping total to present to City Council at the budget session on Tuesday of $650 million to end homelessness in our community and make sure that we don't have people falling into homelessness. And I think, so it's those sorts of things, we can sit here and talk, but I do think it talks about the scale of disinvestment that we've seen and lack of investment in the various systems over the course of the last 50 plus years, on top of all the systemic racism that occurs in that space. And I think to some of what Kendra talked about, I think we get a lot of people talking about handouts, and all sorts of folks have problems with handouts, right? Except for the generational wealth handout that happens, generation over generation. Or that handout is okay for everybody, but any other type of handout for folks is a problem. And I think those are the things we have to fix in our society, in our values as a world and a nation, before we'll ever get to addressing some root, like some physical, I'm experiencing homelessness, I want to end homelessness in my community.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We have a question here from Judith, and I want to throw this to Maggie, since she's going to be leaving us in just a few minutes. You give us the short version of the answer, if you can. So the question is, I agree with all the expressed visions of community and tailored services. I especially appreciate the discussion of gender-based violence. Those cases are horrible for police and victims alike. How can we provide immediate safety and long-term services? Preventative education. Preventative education is a question. Is it preventative education? And clearly police defunding can help fund programs, but how can people access them? I don't know if you have time to answer that, but if you give us.
Well, I think one thing that is really brilliant that Chris brought up was the gender-based education, because I don't know how to end it completely, but to focus that at the beginning, to start, this is how people end up in prison on violent crimes, is because they weren't taught at this age how to control their feelings. So I think that would be one of the things to focus on, and reroute funding into the children. But also, I'm sorry, what was the last part of that question?
The question was about education, and could defunding the police help fund education, and how could we help people access that? Do you think education is a part of that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the the schools for low income, I think that's where we need to start, because they're the ones who actually need to learn these things, because they have parents that are working all the time. So we need to get that into the low income schools and allow them the same opportunity that the people with generational wealth have. So I think if we just implant it into the schools for education, that investment, instead of investing, on new prisons and cleaning up homeless camps, investing into the children would change so many lives.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. You're welcome to stick with us as long as you can. And if you do have to sign off, that's fine. We really appreciate having you on the call. So I want to try to do this thing, Kendra, I don't know if we can do this, let's see, where we bring people who have asked some questions in the chat to join us here and ask their question to us live. And we have a question point that Emmy made to Shoshana. She said, well, let's see if she wants to join us. Let's see.
Hey, JP, you also have people with their hands raised, Pete and Mario.
Okay. I don't see Pete's question. Hold on one sec. Do you see Pete's question? Oh, there. Okay, Pete. So okay, Pete asked about rapid housing solutions. Okay, let's bring Pete on first, and then we'll. Okay, let's ask Pete more. Promote to panelist. All right.
Pete, you're on mute.
Hi, Pete. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Pete Salazar. I'm representing my nonprofit, which is USDVA, that works outside with veterans abroad, but I'm also part of the Veterans Commission for the City of Austin. And the reason why I spoke about rapid rehousing is because I used to work with Caritas of Austin. I used to work with Goodwill. And so when the Veterans Commission was evaluating in the veteran spectrum of, veterans that are living in the streets, we felt, and it's been my experience, that we feel that rapid rehousing is a key element in that, of not only giving people a housing, but also providing wraparound services. For the past 16 years, my job was to get people from the streets back into a place in where they felt safe and transitioned to the level of their experience to go back into housing, but not only housing, but to also reintroduce and reintegrate themselves into society into the way they see fit. And I've done this in Las Vegas. I've done it a variety of places. And I'm born and raised in Austin. I went to Johnson High School. So I have a spectrum of Austin that maybe most people don't have. And that's why I put it on there for the question for y'all to answer to, is because when we're planning these budgetary needs and how we're going to move around funds, any kind of solution without support, and more importantly, without doing the status quo, the status quo of our culture, whether that's service providers, whether that's working, whatever, to reinvent ourselves and refocus on this issue, I think is important, because the questions that we've been discussing now are questions that I've been started discussing 16 years ago. And so then why is that possible? Or how is that possible that we're still discussing the same elements for the past 16 years? And I think part of that is because we've been doing the same thing, the same ways for 16 years.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that. Matt, do you want to take that? Add something or?
Yeah, no, I mean, so Pete, you're talking about rapid rehousing is one program, one type of program that's definitely effective in ending homelessness for people. The wraparound services are key. The rental assistance is key. That whole piece. We have a lot of rapid rehousing programs here in our community doing various things, serving various types of folks. We have a great youth, transitional age youth rapid rehousing program serving folks 18 to 25. Caritas still running their program, the rapid rehousing program for vets also. So, your point's well taken. I think there are some things with rapid rehousing, in communities that are really high cost, communities where the living wage doesn't keep up with the cost of the rental unit over time, which becomes problematic. So you can get folks jobs, get them employment, but that, as a lot of people know in this community, even with a full-time job, most folks don't make enough to sustain the type of income they need in this rental market. So I think, there are some things that rapid rehousing that work really well, and some other things that, that make it problematic in high cost rental markets. But to your point, rapidly moving people into housing programs with services attached is an effective strategy for ending someone's homelessness. And I just want to say one thing, because I do think you're right. Like, I feel I've been in this field and doing this work for about 15 now, almost 16 years. And it does feel like we're doing the same stuff with the same outcome and still seeing people experiencing homelessness. And that is the main factor for that is we do know what ends homelessness in our communities. We just don't have enough of it. And so the supply is, the demand is greater than the supply, and we need to continue to advocate time after time for more resources to scale up the programs that we have.
Thank you. That's awesome. And if anyone else wants to jump in on that, and by the way, if I'm seeing several posted something, Emily, Emmy Aguiar. If anyone wants to join, feel free to raise your hand, and then we'll just know that that you're down to join us in the fishbowl. But if not, I'm going to try to address this question here that was posted by Matt Wallace, who says, do you think it would be a great initiative to involve people experiencing homeless in how we help? I've only been running a free food program for a few months, and I feel like I've learned so much from the folks I serve. Maybe we should try centering their voices. And
I was thinking the same question, and I kind of wanted to combine it with the one before that about thinking about homelessness and housing. In what ways do you think service providers who tend to be majority white organizations can change the way they center services around themselves instead of folks who need and want services to be more welcoming and inclusive? And I immediately think of the Other Ones Foundation, right? Like representation matters in all things. And that would be my answer to both those kind of combined questions about, yes, folks need to be in any service providing, whether it be a food program or other sort of ones, is having people that are representative of the population that you're serving, because in multitude of roles, because you have commonality. Maybe if you don't know them, there's sometimes just like a general commonality you find with folks that look that look like you and maybe from the same neighborhood as you, and undetermined past background and experiences that you just kind of you can connect with, right? And it just helps in providing services, whatever it may be. And also just what could you do when you think about investing in children, right? Allowing them to dream of things that they would want to do, right? And without representation, you sometimes have a limited view of what that looks like. And so that's kind of a broader one, but representation matters. And so I think I would do both those in kind of that time space. But I wanted to hear what others people think about that.
I totally agree with that, Kendra. And I think that that's where also leadership development becomes is really, really crucial to a lot of the work I think that social service providers are doing. And I know at BASTA with our tenant association work, a lot of our work tends to be like pretty slow, that we could get some of the things we want accomplished by picking up the phone and making one phone call, and that one problem could be fixed. But if we're not involving the folks who are directly impacted in the process, and we do it collectively because we do it through organizing, then we're not actually building sustainable power and not putting those voices at the forefront. And so we know when we're organizing well, and new organizers on our team who come after a particularly terrible meeting, they come back and they're like, oh my God, we're doing this strategy, which I think is so stupid, but that's what they wanted to do, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, you're organizing well. That means that if you have a group who has a sense of its own power and they're doing things and they're making decisions and they're listening and they're making a decision which is different than what you want, that means that we're doing this right. And people will learn from mistakes, and sometimes it's not a mistake at all, and the decision they made was the better decision. But I think that's really important. And I think that that's kind of one chunk of the question, which is how do you engage the folks who you're providing services to in the work? But then there's a separate in that separate question of the dominance of white folks who are leading our nonprofit organizations. And I mean, I'm one of those people in kind of a leadership position on housing issues. And there are a lot of white ladies who like to talk about housing and wear the mantle of housing. I'm one of those white ladies. And we need to change that. And we need to change that, but through our hiring practices. We need to change that through promotions and through the way people can advance within the sector. And that is really important, and it's important to name, and it's something which does not need to be. We have power to change that.
Yeah, and I would just add investing in organizations of color, because organizations of color who serve people of color, who run organizations of color, who serve people of color, know what we need. So like investing in those in organizations that are run by people of color would be very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I just to reinforce with some ancillary data. I mean, they did a poll of homeless service providers across the country and found that 70% of leadership is white, and of course we know that that's not representative of the folks we're trying to serve in the community. There's a total disproportionate number, in Austin that has leadership that is white on the nonprofit level. The folks that are leading white organizations, those organizations are usually tabbed as having capacity to take on more funding when it's available. And that piece of what does that really mean? That, well-funded, white-led organizations in communities tend to get more funding. And I think and then of course not, and then they're disproportionately serving, white people that are experiencing homelessness in the community. So all of those things are true. I think that we have to really take a look at, if you're in a leadership position in a nonprofit and you're white, you need to be making sure that your succession plan includes making sure that there's mentorship and a succession plan that includes somebody who is Black or brown, or else you're just not doing it right or understanding what it means to make sure that opportunity is provided in that way. We need to educate our boards on what it means to be, and we need to diversify our boards. Those two things need to happen in this community around the nonprofit work that's happening. Boards tend to be majority white, and they're hiring the leaders of the organization. You're going to get someone who's, majority white leadership. And so I think there's a big flip that has to happen around how the governing happens for nonprofits, not just in this community, but across the country, especially for those that are meant to serve people experiencing homelessness in their communities.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. And I just wanted to add to that, diversifying the board, in various different levels of organizations in Austin is something that needs to be taken very seriously. And it needs to be taken so seriously that it's treated not only as a question of sort of expanding the board, but as a question of possibly certain people being willing to even give up their place in the board to make room for people of color. And I think that's a difficult conversation for some people to have, but I think that is a conversation that is very important in order to open that space for a different kind of solution.
Yeah, JP, I wanted to jump in on this one too, because I agree with what's been said in general, and I think it looks a little different depending on what you're doing. I think in the service capacity, it's overwhelmingly clear that the people in need know what they need, right, and should be driving what the service provision is, and obviously I think there's an even bigger conversation about charity versus mutual aid and how best to help meet the needs of people in our community in need. And then I also think in the area that I primarily work, which is in the advocacy world, I've personally been involved in campaigns where we didn't make an effort to really center folks that were directly impacted by the issue. And I've worked on campaigns, including Homes Not Handcuffs campaign, where we did do that work. And it's undoubtedly clear that centering folks that are going through it bringing them to the city council meetings that you're having whenever you can, like, and doing everything in concert, lockstep with folks who are actually experiencing it. You know, it's an entirely different approach, and they're by far and away their best advocates, the people that are actually going to be impacted by whatever political, legal policy change you're talking about making. And you know, you can have the best prepared pamphlet and one pagers and all this other stuff, but it's not going to match the direct experience and expertise of a person who's actually living it. So I was, yes, second, third, fourth, fifth, taking that approach whenever possible, and in all these different avenues.
Thank you. No, that's awesome. And Chris, James Greer is going to join us now. James, I'm, hold on there. I'm still learning how to do this. Okay, there we go. I think you'll be joining us as a panelist here. If you want to turn on your video, you're welcome to, but definitely turn on your audio. And, oh, I remember you. You were with us last week.
Yeah, hey, hello again.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is more relevant. I asked the same question or a similar question last week. But I think since last week, or right when it was happening last week, the organization Save Austin Now got 20. Yeah, I see the guy from Home's Not Handcuffs. I know that the Matt Makiowak has like personally insulted y'all. Yeah, so they got the 20,000 signatures they needed, legitimately or not, to I guess get their resolution on the ballot to recriminalize homelessness, or at least the camping or the sit and lie down order. And I had like a 3-part question. Are y'all's like how have y'all's respective organizations responded to this, or how do you plan on responding to it action-wise? What can like individual Austinites do to fight back against Save Austin Now? And also, did they do something illegal to get those signatures? I know that the social media, yeah, I know that the social media for AJC posted about the deceitful, like, oh, we're pro homelessness services, just sign right here. But yeah,
Chris,
sorry, I could rant about this for a while. But
well, I can start on this one. Just real quick, they turned in, they reported a little over 24,000 signatures. They need 20,000 ballots. That just kicks off a process where the city clerk will vet those signatures. So the city clerk is within that process now. If they actually have their 20,000 valid signatures, meaning people from Austin or registered voters and all this, then it will go to council in early mid-August, and they have the option at that point to either accept the petition outright or to put it on the November ballot. And so if they have their signatures, and then assuming council doesn't accept their changes, it will go on the November ballot. So what my organization, did honestly was we were part of organizing the counter canvassers that were trying to slow them down, where they were collecting signatures in person. We didn't have as much of an opportunity to do that because of the pandemic, and of course they didn't have as much of an opportunity to actually canvass in person. It's not clear that they've broken any laws that I'm aware of. There were some newspaper reports about potential violations of ethics laws because they didn't file a PAC or report who was financing their efforts. Whether or not that actually has an impact on the signatures and the ballot measure is unclear. It may just be a financial penalty for them if that's the case. And I think, this is very much relevant to this conversation, right? Because last year, what we did was we were able to get the council to largely remove penalties for unavoidable life-sustaining activities for people who live on the streets, including things like sleeping, camping, sitting in line, or asking for help, also known as panhandling. And what Save Austin now is trying to do is trying to make those things against the law again, which what that would mean is that we go from a land today where we see virtually no tickets, even though these laws are still on the books in modified form, where we see virtually no tickets for these offenses now, to one where, a few years ago, we were seeing thousands of these tickets a year. And what this means is actually reinserting police, right, back into, very, very directly into our response to homelessness, which we know doesn't work, one, which we know actually sets people back and keeps people homeless, and two, also, as we've seen with policing in general, risks harm and violence, particularly for folks who are more vulnerable, Black and brown people who are disproportionately experiencing homelessness, as well as folks in mental health crisis who again are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. So it is a disastrous ballot measure that must be defeated. And I'm given some hope by the recent elections that it will be defeated at the ballot box here. How you can get involved, I would say firstly is you can go to our Facebook page, Homes Like Handcuffs, and send us a note, and we will definitely be in touch with you about ongoing efforts. Really, if they get on the ballot, this is going to be a get out the vote effort. It's going to be an effort to educate our friends and neighbors. And luckily, I think it's going to be an election where everybody votes, or as close to everybody as votes in America, right? And so it's really just going to be about letting folks know, especially what this does, because we do have a lot of evidence that they use deceitful practices in how they canvassed. So I would not doubt that those deceitful practices will continue in their advertising for it. So we just have to counteract that with our own education to everyone that we know. So definitely connect with us and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. And this is like a perfect example of this kind of punitive approach that we've been talking about. And it goes beyond even a punitive approach. I think the people who are promoting the Save Austin Now petition, they really want to just eliminate homeless people from the picture. They don't, they want these people to vanish, so to speak. It's borderline genocidal when you really look at.
But it's all connected, to everything we've been talking about, right? Like, I don't want to go on too long here, but like we talked about property and about wealth generation, right? Like we live in a world where if you're old, you have no chance of living in dignity if you don't own property, or you are from a wealthy family, or you've somehow accrued an incredible amount of wages and savings over the course of your life. But for many folks, housing is the key to a dignified aging. We've all become land speculators in order to have this hope, right? Because we know Social Security isn't going to do it. And people think that calling the police on their homeless neighbors is a way of protecting their property. They're protecting their own speculation into this land, which now they see as the key to their own dignified ability to age. And I get it, right? I understand it at that level, but at the same time, like this is part and parcel to the problem, right? Which is that we're valuing property over everyone else, and partly because that property is also the key to our own value, and we see it as connected to our own ability to live in dignity. And so I think really just have to decouple all of that, right? And see ourselves and each other as the things with the most value, ultimately, everything else secondary.
No, thank you. That's perfect. Yeah, I agree. This is a subject where I'm tempted to say several things, but I also want to address. So there's a question that Eric Goff had, a comment that Eric Goff had made a while back. So this is a little bit of a 360, but it's not really, because we're still talking about the same stuff. But he mentioned that Shoshana's discussion about mediation had made him wonder about the connection to housing, and how do people buy into their neighborhoods and apartments and feel and so that it feels like a community public good that is worth mediating and cooperating for, rather than a commercial transaction with a landlord. So this question about how do people buy into that? And that question, it made me think of this little piece here, which I had marked from the book Evicted. This one little piece, he's talking about how a lot of what sort of takes place instead of policing in most neighborhoods is a kind of social cohesion that comes about in the neighborhood when people spend some time in the neighborhood. And you have people that live in that neighborhood and look out for each other and sort of pay attention to what's happening in the neighborhood. And how eviction really disrupts that. So he says a single eviction could destabilize multiple city blocks, not only the block from which a family was evicted, but also the block to which it begrudgingly relocated. In this way, displacement contributed directly to what was called perpetual slums, churning environments with high rates of turnover and even higher rates of resentment and disinvestment. And so just thinking about that concept and how in many ways preventing evictions is itself a way of moving towards a world without police by allowing people to sort of have stability in their neighborhoods, in their communities. But I was wondering if you wanted to say anything more, address that, Shoshana.
I guess I can use that as a shameless plug for the Eviction Solidarity Network. So there were some comments about the pending flood of evictions. There's a moratorium right now in Travis County until September 30th, which everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The other week when it was announced, it was after a lot of work. But eventually all of the tenant protections we have currently in place in Austin, which tenant protections like the likes of which we have never seen before in Texas, but all of those only buy more time. They're not actually giving money and waving a magic wand to get rid of the rental arrears. And so eventually at some point we're kicking the can down the road and kicking it again and kicking it again. And there is going to be a flood of evictions. So the Eviction Solidarity Network is organizing to show up, to witness evictions, to track evictions, to be able to collect data, to put it out through an Eviction Solidarity dashboard. We also have a rapid response team, which is going to be doing everything from trying to connect tenants with services to try to prevent the evictions, to helping with mutual aid, and then also good old direct action for bad landlords. So that's a way to be raising awareness of this issue, and also to be thinking about, okay, we have better tenant protections at this moment, right? This is what our world looks like. This is how these protections have helped, but what could the world look like in the future? That the world doesn't need to be the way it is in this moment, and the world doesn't need to have, is the quote Euro JP, this like churn of evictions and the violence and disruption that the eviction causes on one family, and then the ripple effect to the broader community. And then those folks end up with, going to Echo and Echo's partners because they're on the street. And then we're in this huge cycle, and a needless, really, really needless cycle.
I also just want to make the statement that a lot of folks think that evictions are the result of poverty or someone not, when actually that more times than not, right, they're the cause of people falling into poverty and not the result of the current poverty that they're potentially living in. It's not always a non-payment of rent as an eviction, like we talked about when the police get involved too. I think it's really important to mention that those acts can, an eviction can lead to somebody's homelessness and lead folks into poverty, not because they don't have the ability to pay for another apartment, but because it shuts off access to any housing options for many people based on tenant selection criteria and in other ways too. So not only are you closing the literal door on someone who's going to then need to find another place to live, but you're almost cutting off all the lifeline to any potential new housing option for them. So I think that those two, the cascading effect of that is monumental, I think, and not always, the majority of folks will not just pick up and move to another place. That's not how this process works. They will be shut off from most other, even affordable housing complexes, things meant to help people who are in low income situations. Even some housing assistance isn't available to people who have an eviction on their record. I mean, it's just preposterous to think about the avalanche of circumstances people will find themselves in after something like that.
And I think that also goes to a lot of housing programs and housing which we subsidize, where what we want is the perfect poor person. And the perfect person who's experienced all of this trauma in their lives and somehow is just like pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, right? And like we have to dispel that. Like that person doesn't exist, or they're very few and far between. We're dealing with real people who are products of structural inequality, structural racism, and a lot of freaking trauma. And so their lives are messy, and that's the reality. And so what we have to do is we have to problem solve with that reality and with that messiness, and roll up our sleeves and figure it out and say, housing providers, like if you want to house this population, if you want like government money, then you need to be willing to engage in the messiness with a commitment that we want to keep folks housed.
Brittany Bays, we're nearing our wrap-up time. Actually, we might be going slightly over time, but that's just kind of how we roll. If anyone needs to sign off, though, feel free. But Brittany put a question in the Q&A, and let me see if she's raising her hand. Brittany, you're not raising her. Do you want to? Oh yeah, she's raising her hand. Yay, okay. Which means that you get promoted to panelist.
Yeah, and I actually think her question is pretty good, and so you might be kind of a closing our wrap-up kind of last question.
Yeah, I was thinking so too. So let's see if she. Okay.
There we go. So hi guys. Yeah, I was curious, especially coming off of last week's webinar, where there's a really great discussion around the intersection of social work and police, and the distance that our current reality is from really standing up new programs in a world without police, and a lot of the work and investment that needs to be done in order to see that reality. So kind of in that spirit, I was curious, are there places where you guys feel that we're doing things well in partnership with police and homeless service providers that we would want to keep or stand up in a new way in a world without police?
Thank you for that awesome question. Chris?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I wouldn't presume to answer the if it's going well question ultimately, because I think someone who's on the receiving end of those services should speak to their efficacy ultimately. I would say that from my perspective, that and this is kind of the broader point too. There's nothing to do with the individuals that wear whatever type of uniform it is. It's based on what skills they have and temperament they bring to the work, and ultimately what the problem is that needs to be solved. And to me, when I think of police are people who are primarily trained in the execution of violence, primarily they're equipped for that purpose as well. And they carry with them the authority of the state to use coercive violence. And there doesn't seem to be a role in the problem of homelessness for which someone with that equipment, training, and authority is useful. Ultimately, so For me, I think about this with almost all of the problems of the world. There are people with different skill sets, different equipment, different training, and in a different set of incentives and authority that ultimately need to be central to the problem of homelessness.
And just if I might also presume to jump in here, I can't speak for Chris and Shoshana and Matt, but from the perspective of AJC and the work that we do, like I hope to work myself out of a job. I hope that I want to work to reach a point where I don't have to do the advocacy that I now do. And I think it's important for us to recognize in response to some of these social problems, or what are perceived as social problems that need to be fixed, but are oftentimes systems that are engineered to produce a certain result from the beginning. And then we kind of create these, the nonprofit industrial complex, we create these solutions, these bureaucracies around trying to address these social problems that become these sort of self-perpetuating things. And so I think it's important for us to have our eyes towards a place of greater liberation, where a lot of those things can actually become useless or dissolve into a place where they're no longer needed. It's not like I want to live in a world where eventually, I'm not going to answer for the other panelists. I want to hear what other people have to say about this.
I was just going to concur with Chris. And if you have someone that's doing something wrong, like for the police, like do they need to be called the police? And is there can they transfer that role into someone else, or them themselves be in a new role that's not comes with that kind of authoritative militarization that police do? And so I was just going to agree with Chris on that.
Thank you for your question, Brittany. If anyone else wants to jump in on that as well.
Oh, sorry, Shoshana, go ahead.
No, you go.
I would say I don't have much to add beyond what's been said, except for that I think that the truth we have to speak to it is also the trauma that people experiencing homelessness have associated with police intervention. And so that the continued exposure to that trauma, I think, and the conditioning that people experiencing homelessness have towards how to respond to police intervention now, to me, and I do agree with Chris that many times, almost every time, talking to people who are experiencing the intervention is the right thing to do about whether or not it's an effective intervention. However, I even think there are times when we're talking about police intervention with people experiencing homelessness that some folks would have a hard time even telling you how traumatic that event has been for them over time, because of how institutionalized it's become to see a police officer and respond in a certain way, that I don't know that there's any ever coming back. You could send 10 social workers with a police officer, and I'm not sure that intervention would be, while it might change slightly the outcome because the police officer might have a different outlook on how to intervene with the person experiencing homelessness, the trauma there for that person experiencing homelessness would almost certainly still remain. And I would just be really hesitant to think that there wouldn't be a better way to invest that money. It would be hard for me to come up with any other answer but that. So.
Well, I want to thank everybody, but I do want to close out with any sort of takeaways that you want to give to the audience, or kind of going back to JP's original question about what does a world without police look like, and anything that you want to add on to kind of what you envision and that you want to share with everybody else. Chris.
Yeah, sure. I'll break the silence. I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore. It just talks about abolition. She talks about it's not just about tearing down the buildings, right? It's about creating conditions where the buildings aren't necessary. And so I think we want to do both, right? we want to tear down the buildings, but we also want to couple that with eliminating the reasons why we approach things from this way, why we use these certain things. And so in this conversation, I think it's been stressed plenty, but the biggest piece of that is actually just is housing, right? And specifically decommodified social housing, so that we can actually have places for people to be, and they're not by virtue of their simple presence in the world and trying to live potentially subject to criminal violations and law enforcement. So
I only have two things. I was just like, trust is hard, and it's the foundation of everything that we've built as a society and as a nation. But figuring out how to extend that first, right? And then also talk to strangers. I, for one, have issues talking to strangers, as awkward as I am. But if people can figure out how to do that and to extend a little trust and empathy and compassion, I think would be in a better place.
Anyone want to add any last closing thoughts, words?
Yeah, I'm probably worse at talking to strangers and making friends than you are, Kendra. So maybe we could learn from each other a little bit. I would just say it is a time for action for folks, and I mean, I think the passive nature that you might have experienced in the past to say, yeah, I support that, and you support it, and you support looking at a different way to, reimagining policing, reimagining community. I would just say it's time to take action in those areas. And there's some organizations on this call, on this panel represented in the attendees that I think are great ones to talk to about how you can take action and become more involved in the solutions and being part of the solutions, because you will make the solutions stronger that we come to with your input and just your presence. And I'd encourage folks to just get involved and to make it a priority to get involved and make new friends, and you can practice with me.
I'll just say that as we're talking about reimagining the police, of pushing ourselves on what reimagining police looks like, and extending beyond just police, but of the behavior which we replicate in our private lives as well, because that infuses so much of our society, those power imbalances and the way in which we problem solve. And I think we had a really rich discussion about kind of alternative ways of problem solving and how that pops up. And it's not just a police officer who's there. It's often someone who isn't even associated with law enforcement, but that the way in which they're trying to solve a problem is with a kind of law enforcement mentality. And so that this is a moment for us to really be deconstructing that in every facet of our lives, even if we don't see it, even if it's not police, it's there. And so be on the lookout and think through, okay, can we solve this differently?
No, that's beautiful. That's awesome. And at the risk of trying to add something at the end of that perfect closing, I do want to say that, just thinking about it, for me, a world without police really is a world where we rethink the idea of home, both where we say that everyone deserves to have a home, and then also that people deserve to feel at home in the city, in public spaces, that there should be a real sense of being able to feel at home in your community, on your street, and not just on your street, on the bus and in various places. And thinking all the way back to, in the first episode of this series, we talked about how the Austin Police Department was born in the context of creating vagrancy laws at the end of the Civil War to recriminalize Black people who had been freed, Black people who had been emancipated from slavery. and how that process of controlling where people are allowed to be and where people are allowed to feel at home is very much central to the role of policing in Austin, and how closely that is connected to, a home, having a home, land ownership, and these questions that we've been asking. So I think that, if I were to add one thing, I would just say that, like, think about the role that your home has in your life. Think about the effect that your home has on your mental health, on your emotional health, and then think about what it means to deprive people of that, and what it means to punish people with the threat of removing that, if they happen to be poor, or for some reason are in dire straits. So let's allow ourselves to go beyond this idea that the only people who deserve to have a home or to feel at home are people who have chunks in the bank, and think a new paradigm of what home is. Thank you all for joining us for 1 week. I look forward to going out and causing trouble with y'all in the streets. not just in the streets, in the community, in City Hall. We'll have some good times. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah, have a good night.
With us.
Yeah. See y'all.
Night.